Hi, my name is Benedict. This is a second video in a series. The first one I did yesterday, which covered basic waveforms, which you will see up there when I edit it. To very quickly recap, obviously I'd love you to go and watch that video so that this one makes more sense as it picks up, but failing that you can probably pick up from here. But as we cover in that, the wave that you hear when you're synthesizing a sound, like we're talking pure synthesis here, the same works with sampling, but you just don't have that level of control. But the waveform that you see, the shape that you see, like what you see here, reflects what you hear. So smooth, sharp, and no doubt you are hearing that transform from a smooth sound to a sharp sound. And that is purely the shape of the wave. That's why those wave shapes are drawn that way, because they actually represent what, in loose terms, the speaker cone is trying to do as you hear them. As in the case of our sine wave, which is what you see here, the cone is going out, slowing down, coming back, slowing down, going out, slowing down. So it's a rounded movement, which is a very, very comfortable movement for a loudspeaker, because there's no sudden movement there. It's just moving very comfortably, effectively the way that I'm moving my hand. Because if you measured that, you'd probably find that it was moving more in a sine wave, or almost like a circular wave, than a kind of pattern. Because as soon as you've got the it bit in it, it actually creates a kind of distortion, because under the laws of physics, things don't like to change direction. None of us like to change our minds. As soon as you ask a speaker to change the direction it's going in, it distorts. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because we love that sound, but just as the movement gets sharper or harder physically to do, then the more overtones you get coming out of that sound. In other words, the brighter it gets. Yesterday we looked at the basic waveforms that you find in an analog style synth. So sine wave, triangle wave, which adds a few more overtones, square wave, which is pretty harsh, and the sawtooth, which effectively has all of the overtones in the series. The other form that we looked at was pulse, which effectively starts life as a square wave, and as you pulsify it, you notice that the fundamental reduces in volume. So rather than getting that sloped look, not too hard in mirror, rather than getting that slope across here, you start to have an even level of all of the overtones or the harmonics in that series, which creates that really thin, edgy sound. So there are basic forms. Now we're going to start to look at some more complex forms. Those four basic forms that we looked at yesterday can be used to create most real-world type instruments. So very simplistically, if you were to set out to recreate an orchestra using nothing but, let's say, a mini-moog, depending on where you live, then in theory you could do it with those four oscillator forms. You're going to hit some limits, but in theory you could do it. And I have a pretty fair idea of how far you can go, because I've actually done some of that work using Europa and some other synths within reason. Subtractor's one of my favorites for doing that, particularly doing woodwind type sounds. It's got some very clever parameters that allow you to really get that kind of tone. I also used Oberon and did some work in there as well, and that was also really pretty darn cool. Oberon was out before Europa, now Europa's here. It's just so easy being in the same mindset in Europa as I have in Thor. So nothing against Operon, it's a real synthesis lab, and I still use it. But Europa is really easy to use too, and there are some similarities, which may suck a little bit for poor Mr. Zvork, who made Operon, because some of the ideas are the same here, but no matter, we're focusing on waves and forms. So, smooth, sounds smooth. Harsh, sounds harsh. You see in the middle here, we get an interesting shape. Smooth, sharp, sharp, smooth, sharp. These are the sorts of waveforms that digital synthesis really specializes in. And as a result, we end up with a lot more happening in the overtone series, the harmonic series. Now remember here, this sounds muted because we've got little to nothing happening in the overtones. There's nothing happening here. All we're hearing is that fundamental. I press C1, all you hear is C1. That's it. You're not hearing any of the other harmonics, which are effectively like playing other keys. It's the beginning of a square wave. I'm just playing 2 octaves up. So as we move into the scary territory, we start to increase the number of harmonics which are actually active and how loud they are. Therefore, that sound appears to become harsher or thinner. As you saw when we went into the pulse wave and we really narrowed that pulse, our fundamental actually lowered in volume compared to the overtones, which makes that sound start to seem thinner and thinner, till we get that sort of Stevie Wonder clavinet type sound. Great sounds, and none of this is about judgment on which oscillators are good and which oscillators are bad. And there was a lot of that through the 80s and early 90s, and as we started to use DAWs, digital audio workstations, because people made the mistake of not realizing that whilst we've got all those overtones going along there, we're asking the ear to hear an awful lot more high end than it's used to hearing. Therefore it goes, wow, this sounds really bright, or really hard, or really harsh. We can solve that instantly by putting a filter on it. And if that doesn't sound like something that might come out of, say, a Korg MS-20, MS-10, MS-20, you got no idea. It does really sound like it. So you can have an incredibly digital synth, but if you treat it like you're using, as though you were using an analog instrument, you get a surprisingly similar sound before we even get into any of the playing around with messing up the pitches of the notes that you play, or any of that sort of mungification that you get with real electronics, real voltages. So simply, rather than saying that digital synthesis or digital waveforms are bad, merely understand that digital waveforms tend to have an awful lot more happening up here in the top end of the partials, or top end of the harmonic series, so they sound bright. There are some issues to do with Nyquist frequency and what have you, but really, honestly, don't waste your time with that kind of garbage. What it sounds like is what's important to you. This morning I was working around with something else, and I was using Subtractor, and I thought, oh, there's that little low bandwidth button. I haven't pressed the low bandwidth button in years, because we're all told, oh no, you want the higher sampling rate. Press the low bandwidth button and bugger me if the whole thing doesn't become kind of brighter in a cool way. We might be able to get bent out of shape about how it's not as accurate as it should be. It sounds good in the right situation, so who the hell wouldn't want to use it? And my very first synthesizer that I had in the late 80s was a Casio CZ1000, which was an unashamedly digital instrument. It was a phase distortion instrument. So in effect, its maths was not a million miles away from a Yamaha DX7, which is generally held up to be one of the coolest digital synths known to mankind. I struggled with the idea of having digital sound, but the reality was a lot of the sounds that I was making when I go back now, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Vince Clarke really didn't care. He ran something like 10 of the little bastards all at once. So, waveform gets brighter. You can take advantage of that. The most common ways to take advantage of that are adding multiple copies and detuning them, putting on effects units, and of course tons of delay and reverb. So if you start to play around with that sound in terms of the time element, you get these really nice, bright, super detailed sounds because they're digital. Not because they're digital at all, simply because they are creating more of that harmonical overtone series. If we put them through an analog style filter, we'll speed that back up so we still get our bite back. Or turn that off and we can play around with digital style filters. That's got the little click on the front, the DC click. Nice and warm. Because all we're doing is we're taking a complex wave, which is this fella, complex. And then we're rolling off that stuff up top. So we can make really, really complex waves and then use them as a building block to do something else. Now you might say, well, why don't you just use a normal square wave? When you do an awful lot of filtering, sometimes it doesn't make a lot of difference. But if we want to do a little less filtering, you can hear how that balance of the high part of the sound is still changing. And therefore, by balance, as the higher harmonics get louder, the mind effectively hears the lower harmonics as quieter. We can even get into controlling that sort of stuff by making our own waveforms for our filter. Sorry, just so we can become quite dramatic. Let's be fair and go back to a square wave. And while in theory we can do that with an analog synth, it takes a lot of effort because we've got to create that waveform. Generally, analog synth has got your 4 basic waveforms. If you've got a modular, yes, you can route things around, and if you really know what you're doing and understand it, you can make, in theory, any waveform you want, but honestly, it's a bit of a pain in the ass. And it's not going to be polyphonic. You're not playing any chords like that. So we can control the shape of the wave in lots of different ways. Now sound in music, but in everything in life, sound is all about subtlety. Absolute subtlety. So the difference between different waveforms, you can on the surface go, well, yeah, there's really no difference there at all, Benedict, what are you talking about? Yeah, fair enough. Actually, let me show you this. Let's take and make this as a noise wave. Yuck. And on the graphic I put up before, I said if we get a wave much more complex than this imaginary one that I drew, it's going to sound like noise. This is increasingly sounding like noise. If we create any kind of movement, then we end up with noise. So we can say something like this. We've got a sine wave. Turn that down a little bit. Compare that to without. Again, we're not looking for what's good or bad, or what we're merely looking for. Same filter. This is allowing me to add in a little bit more ting to that sound. So it can get really we can go all the way from that so it's all about the subtlety. Just as my voice is unique to me, and your voice is unique to you, if you have a brother or a sister, or let's say you have a twin, an identical twin, brother, sister, whatever, they actually sound different from you. A lot of people may struggle to tell the difference, but they sound different from you. Their voice is different, even though they're essentially sort of the same as you. Freaky stuff. But we don't have the same voice. There are similarities, but there are differences as well. So it's those little things, those little differences, that help us define one sound over another. That sound and that sound are not the same sound. Or that, or that, or that, or that, or that, or that. So the advantage of the digital synthesizer and getting into really complex waves is that if we're playing around with that and go, yeah, look, I like it, but I wanted to cut through the mix a little bit more, I want a little bit more ting. If we're stuck only in the analog thinking world, and that includes indoors where we tend to only think analog, then we're put in terms of trying to put overdrive on stuff. See how it's still doing kind of the same thing? It's brightening it up, but the sound really is not the same. But of course it goes horrifically downhill when we try and play polyphonically. Whereas creating that complexity of waveform here means that we've got a lot of flexibility. And we can soften that sound up, remember, if we want to. There's nothing wrong with that. We can also do things that I've gotten into in other articles, things like adding some pitch variability, any of those sorts of tricks, but they're kind of by the by. I'm only just introducing them because I know that some people will be going, yeah, but it sounds digital, it's no good, man. And I was like, okay, fair enough, but you're getting yourself caught in the same trap that I did back in the late 80s and early 90s, where I was very sort of and a little good digital bad. And despite the fact that I had a digital synth, and effectively all my synths were digital, it meant that I spent a lot of time being unhappy with those instruments rather than being able to use them for what they did really, really well. So we can complexify our waves in any way that we see fit. Let's take this fellow here. Turn off our filter. Now, if it's a true additive synth, we can go through and actually turn up and down the volume level of each of the overtones or harmonics in that series. Like getting a graphic equalizer on every single one of the partials there and turning them up and down to suit. And there are instruments out there that do that very, very nicely. Jiggery Pokery's actually got an instrument that does that incredibly well and really simply. And you can do that in a few other things, including Spectre, which is a great RE, which a rack extension I worked on. But it's fiddly. It's fiddly. You've got to really be kind of dedicated. And when you get to trying to make really complex waves like this, you just kind of start to go, too hard. Which is why we've got the combined interface here and messing around with waveforms here and then being able to modify them using something that we recognize. Doesn't matter how you get there, as long as you get the shape and sound that you want. But we can add any kind of layer of complexity that we like. We can have our sawtooth. Let me just drop that an octave. It's time to pulsify it, or a pulse again on the other side. And say we decide to notice how that's gone up an octave. We've doubled that wave. Well, hello. It's now got twice a thing happening twice. Which leads me to, let's kill that off, taking some of these modifiers. So we've got hard sync once, and that's borrowing the idea of hard sync from an analog instrument and just multiplying it by itself. You can self-multiply, which is a similar thing. These are all very simply maths functions. Don't fuss too much what they are. They've been given a name here, which makes them easier to make sense of. If we were a serious mathematician, we'd have X, Y, N, Q, 48A, or something or other, and we go, oh. So, follow the names and that'll help you to make sense of them. Like quantize. You can see we're effectively reducing the bit rate, which is awfully similar to downsample. No doubt there is some difference. Mirror. We merely take that sound and act like it's going through a mirror. Invert is essentially the same. Phase distortion is an interesting one. You've got no phase distortion. And we're offsetting our phase, which is really essentially what I was doing here. So a lot of times the phase of how your object works inside its box has a lot to do with the sound. Noise mod. This one's fun. So let's take our sawtooth. Cool. So everything we've done here is pure waveform creation. There's no actual filtering going on here at all. I've said I'll start with what's essentially a sawtooth wave. I will multiply that by noise. So each partial is randomly multiplied. Turn this fellow off. You can see it jiggling around. Not jiggling, jiggling. Jiggling lots. That's all in the waveform that we're doing that. And then we can add a Minimoog style filter. Or of course if we want to, we can add our own kind of filter. Let's just pull that down. So that's creating a band pass filter. Sneaky effect. Simply because you can hear it cascade through the partials. That's just a little thing that you get with additive synthesizers. But remember, we're still only creating a wave here. We're not filtering as such. We're only acting like we're filtering. We're just saying to the maths, I want you to change the shape of the wave. So if we added LFO1, and if we got that's a sound that, in theory, you could get from an analog synth, but in reality you're probably not going to. Not in a hurry anyway, not as quickly as I made that. So, to me that's a beautiful organic sound. Whether you like it or not is a personal opinion, but in case of what it does, it's, I think, brilliant. We can put it through an analog style filter, which is another kind of DSP. And get the kind of thinking that we're used to. See, we've got a lot of flexibility now in the kinds of waves that we create. That's one way we could add noise, but there's another way we can add noise in here, and that's this one. Sounds a little different, really, really useful. I like that quite a lot. So if I'm making a string type sound, turning a bit loud. Very, very bright. But if we analogify it with a depending upon where I start that noise happening in the partial series, you see it starts really high. So again, we're just playing with the waveform, we're making a more complex waveform. More complex waveforms sound brighter. That's very simple math. The harder the shape here is here, the harder the shape is in our ears. Which means, as I say, we can then start to get creative with how we think about how those are going to go. See here, I've actually managed to cut off some of the fundamental just by putting a little bit of pulse type behavior. So if I go back to adding just a little bit of noise to what's going on, put it back in my chorus and reverb. Sound that can sit beautifully in a mix. And because it's cutting off some of that harmonic, or the fundamental, gives a little bit more of a string machine kind of sound. Again, whether you like the sound or not doesn't really matter. The idea that you can say, okay, I like basically what I've got here, which is this. But I want to add or subtract. Some harmonics to it. We can start to create all kinds of interesting sounds for ourselves. And the more you play with that and understand the correlation between the shape that you see and the tone that you hear, the easier it's going to get, especially if you can then correlate the shape, the tone, and the tone that you're hearing from something externally, and start to go, you know what, they actually have similarities. Then you can start to focus on doing things that get them closer to one another. Don't waste your time trying to duplicate them. A synthesizer is never meant to photocopy an orchestra. I know that was put in the marketing brochure, but it's not what they're there for. But with care and understanding some of the components of how that sound's made, and the more you listen, the more detailed you train your mind to be, and it takes time. 30 years in, and there's still plenty for me to learn. The more focused you can be in that way, the more you're able to hear those little details that appeal to you and say, I can make my instrument do that. I want a bit of vibrato. That's easy, any idiot can do that, so let's do it. But what say I hear that getting a little out of tune as the instrument is first played. Let's go back to my envelope 1. I can now create that, send it to pitch. We barely hear that difference, but it is there. Once you put it in a mix, then you're going to hear quite a lot there. Yeah, we're getting quite a bit of pitch movement in there. Maybe too much. You're going to define that as you go into your piece. You may decide to use some sort of controller so that you've got one knob to rule the amount of magnification that you've got there. But you've got options. But remember, it's not anywhere near so much about the filter as it is about creating the right waveform. In theory, not easy, but in theory, if you knew exactly the sound that you wanted, you could actually draw the right waveform. See, no filter at all. I can actually create a smoother tone. Okay. Funny looking waveform, but now if we look at it, what have we got? We've got a kind of sawtooth. It is that sawtooth shape. But just by putting a few kooky doohickeys in it, we've given ourselves something which is well suited to the role that it's designed to play. Again, up to you what kind of sounds you want to make. Obviously, if you want to get into the whole EDM type thing, we will choose some sort of suitably ugly wave and take one of our envelopes. Let's say envelope 4, just to see what happens to that. It's getting really into ugly tone. Not my idea of fun, and I'm no good at that sort of EDM, dubsteppy kind of uglified sound. It's not my thing. But you can see just by making it do all kinds of interesting things and get jagged and interesting, you get that, what we'll call an interesting sound. If we find something that's a bit more... That one doesn't work as well as I thought it might. We'll go with that. If you're into that, you've got a better idea of how you actually create those sounds. But nonetheless, you can push yourself into that ugly EDM territory. And don't be upset with me calling it ugly, because you know it's ugly, you want it to be ugly. By creating evolving moving waves, and simply you'll learn as you go, moving yourself into uglier waveforms. So you could also be doing things like playing with, say, folding, and attach that to your envelope 4. So what you want to do is entirely up to you. I primarily focus on nicer, more musical sounds, more instrumental type sounds. But if you want to get out into that sounds like garbage arena, then understanding how wave shapes work is going to be increasingly useful, because you can make those sorts of sounds if you want them. And it doesn't mean that I don't find those kinds of sounds useful myself. I will use them for things, normally for noise, but that's an interesting instrument in itself, potentially in the right mix. So, to recap, we start with the idea of very simple waves, which is, let's just kill that stuff off. Our sine waves, very, very simple. Sounds simple, looks simple, sounds simple. And then as we morph ourselves into complex waves, they sound increasingly complex. Very distinctive sort of DX7 type bass sound, which you're only going to get if you're looking for that kind of sound, and the reason why you wouldn't be, especially if you're doing vaporwave, retrowave or something like that. Now you've got a sense of, okay, there's not much point looking at that kind of wave, not getting you what you want, not happening. Whereas if you start to go into waves kind of don't look the same, but we're getting similar results. As you get up into the more complex, ugly-looking waves, you'll find that they tend to sound more similar, simply because higher frequencies tend to sound a little bit more the same to us. So an electric guitar right up here, and a violin right up here, can be quite similar in sound. Some people may be mortally offended to hear that, but that's just part of the nature of it, which is part of why I'm also showing you these sounds lower, simply because the ear hears the difference a lot better than up here. So don't be afraid of playing with more complex waves, but really take your time and start with a simple wave. And this is where something like Europa, or any of these ones where you can draw your wave in, or have a certain amount of control over your wave in the first place, without it being complex. Allow you to make really interesting sounds. Oops, I was playing with the wrong one. So if you want to, you can create, let's say we pop, there's our basic sound there in 4. You will find effects tend to swallow some of your differences. Because it's easy to be making a sound and go, I'm not hearing the difference, but the difference there is not huge. You can see how the waveform here adjusts. So even though it's filtered, it changes. And in this case, if you're wanting a bassier sound, like something with just a little bit more sort of whoop in it, that's actually managed to achieve that, which is not a million miles from actually taking a sawtooth sound and whacking a little bit of drive on it. Hear how that is not so different from different situations. So it's just different ways to achieve the same thing. Using overdrives on the end is super cool these days, but it's not always a controllable way of doing things. There's always a horrible trade-off. Changing the waveform allows you to do things like doing that without so much of a trade-off. So you could choose to say, okay, I'll adjust the wave to give me half of what I wanted my overdrive to do, and then I'll halve the amount of overdrive. So I've got some of the advantages of overdrive, but I've chopped out and minimized the disadvantages by, rather than only relying on the overdrive and then perhaps layering extra things on top of it to try and solve the problems I've created, I can perhaps know what I'm looking for in the first place sonically and say, okay, I will create that at the waveform, and then I either don't need this extra unit on the end, that's going to work real nice in a mix, or if I do still want it there, the extra bit of drive that it's going to give, and personally I'd probably use a different unit from this, but I can get nice things from this. I often use it in brass sounds, particularly the sine, because it puts some mid sort of metallic rattle in there. But I'm not suffering from the nastiness if I'm going to end up using that sound in another way. See what I mean? So covered a lot of ground, kind of not as focused as the first of the pair of these, simply because this is a massive arena. You start to, hello, thank you. That's the film I'm about to work on. Brilliant. Thanks, Malachi. This is a much broader area where you really get to branch out and say, I'm going to make my own sound. Because you probably don't walk to your device, to your door, going, ooh, I'm going to make a waveform that's this shape. You know, you're just not walking out to do that. You play around and you go, okay, well, what am I going to do? Okay, great, that adds something that I do like. You may say, I don't really like that, but if you're smart, you remember it. And next time you're playing with a sound and sort of going, oh, yeah, I know, but I'm not loving this sound. That's what I was looking for, kind of thing. Your brain learns those patterns. It creates this massive spreadsheet of, I know that sound. I know what that sound looks like. And so you can do something like going, okay, I'll take the existing wave that I've got, this one here, say, I'm going to put a little hitch in him. And you'll find, hang on, that starts to get me closer to the sound that I want. Winning. That's how you work this out. So, great big broad subject, great big sprawling thing as is usual from me, but hopefully through going through that and thinking about what I've done and then practicing yourself, you know, getting out your own instrument. If you're not a reason man, and odds are you aren't, then getting an instrument that does similar sorts of things one way or another. Then you'll start to find that you've got this tremendous amount more ability to make the sounds that you're looking for, rather than having to dial through presets hoping you're finding the right one. Thanks very much. See you next time.